Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take a look at a pair of functions that is part of a larger project, which is our core library. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on the file read function and essentially two ways that you can read characters out of a file, retrieve them from a text file, and then ultimately use them then later on. So we're gonna first start off. We're going to take a look at a function that we've not yet spent too much time with, and that is the fgetC. We've used fscanf now a few times, but I'd like to take just a second to look at the Wikibooks documentation with respect to fgetC. fgetC actually returns an integer associated with the character at the current position in the file. If it fails to return a character from that position, then you're going to get an error code. You see the error codes below: -1, -2, -3, and so on. With the only issue, if you would, is that if somehow your file or your stream has the characters that correspond to the ASCII values of 25 and 26, which are the substitute and the escape characters. So we're going to assume that I have not given you a bad text file. And instead, what we'd like to do is we'd like to see how fgetC works. And then later on in the video, we will also take a look at fscanf. We will ultimately be using fscanf, but I would like to make you aware that fscanf is merely one way to read a file. There are other potential options. So to begin with, if you take a look, our function gets a file name as an array and also has a contents as an array. And so the idea here is that we would like to be able to pull the values out of the file and ultimately put them in the contents. And so the first thing that we want to do is using fopen. We would like to open the file name, and we're going to assume that the file is there, so we want to open it for reading. Now, as always with a file, you want to make sure that the file does in fact exist. So the first thing that we want to check is that the input is not equal to null. And this means that the file exists. Else, the file does not exist. All right, there we go. Sorry about that, misspelled it. And if the file does not exist, then what we want to do is we want to print a message back to the user: error, file name does not exist. And one of the things that you can do to perhaps make your application a little more user-friendly is you can actually include the name of the file that was attempted to be passed using a placeholder %s. And then in there, you simply include then the file name itself. Now, we can do more improvement on the error checking as we go along. For instance, one of the things that you would consider doing is checking to see whether or not the user actually passed the file name you did by determining the length of the string and so on. But we're going to leave that for another video. Instead, what we want to do is we want to focus on the behavior of our fgetC. Now, assuming that we've been able to successfully open the file, then the first thing that we want to do is we actually want to go ahead and close it. Now, inside of this if statement, what we want to do is we want to pick out the characters in the file using a while loop. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say while our f gets c, and remember that our f gets c is going to accept a input argument of the file pointer. It's going to assign this value then to the current variable. So in other words, we're going to pull a character out of the file. We're going to assign it now to the current variable. And the idea here is that we want to make sure that that value that's returned is greater than 0. So I'm going to use an extra set of parentheses here. And while current equal to f gets c, pulling characters out of our file is greater than 0, what I want to do is I simply want to print f whatever that character might be. So I'm going to specify the %d, which will be the count, and then whatever that character might be. And what we want to do is we want to use our counter variable just to keep count of how many characters are in the file. And then what we'll do now is we will write out also the current character. So outside of the while loop, what you want to do is you want to initialize your count equal to 0. And then every time a character is pulled out of the file, you simply increment the count. All right, so we'll do both of these first, and then we will go about testing them. The second example using the fscanf we've actually seen before, so I won't spend quite as much details on this one. Essentially, it's the same steps. So we want to use our fopen to read the, to open the file name rather. The first thing that you, of course, want to do is check to see that our input is not equal to null. Just as before, as a matter of fact, you could go ahead and copy these 2 lines of code. We want to let the user know that the file does not exist. If we were able to successfully open the file, then we want to go ahead and close it before we forget to. And then at this point, then we want to simply start picking characters out of the file. And this is going to be using our while loop. And so our while then fscanf, we want to specify that we're interested in pulling a character out of the file. We want to store it at the location current. And if this is not equal to end of file, then we simply want to increment our count. And once again, just like before, we will initialize our count equal to 0. And then just like in the previous example, we want to simply print out the number or the essentially the location in the file and the character itself. So we'll have here our count and our current. Now, that was only part of our goal in this demonstration. Once again, I'm trying to focus on the similarities and the differences between these 2 functions. So in both cases, essentially, we are continuing until the end of file with the fgetC simply returning some other value, in other words, a value either a -1, -2, or -3 if it encounters a problem, where the fscanf is going to return an end of file. So essentially the structure is very similar between the 2. And then the only thing that we want to do different that we haven't already done, but it's similar between the 2 functions, is we also want to update the count, the contents. And so we update the contents using contents square brackets count. because remember that our arrays are 0 based. And then we want to assign to that location in the contents variable the value stored in current. And once again, same thing down here inside of our while loop, contents, square brackets, count. In this case, the current is a character. So what we're doing here is we are leveraging the implicit conversion between an integer and a character. So notice that my return, or rather not my return, but my array that's being passed is a character array in both examples. All right, so let's go ahead and build it. Let's see if we've got any errors in our functions. And then let's go about seeing how we are going to call it. See, I have a little minor typo here. I forgot to specify that I was going to read the file. Let's go ahead and build it one more time. All right, one more time here. So our fscanf, the error that I always make is I forget to include my file pointer. So fscanf, first argument is going to be the file pointer. Second argument will be the data type. Let's go ahead and build it one last time. All right, good. So we've gotten rid of all of our bugs. Most of them were pretty simple to deal with. That, by the way, happens to be my most common mistake. Whenever I use fscanf or fprintf, I always seem to forget my file pointer. Now what we want to do is we want to come up here to our triage if statements here, and we want to think about what's it going to take to successfully call either fread fgetc, file read fgetc, or our file read fscanf. Well, first of all, I'm just going to simply use the name of the function to be able to call as a switch to be able to call it. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create now a else if branch, and that else if branch is actually going to require 3 arguments. And so the first argument, of course, is going to be the name of the executable. The second is going to be the switch associated with whichever function that we want to call. So in this case, it's going to be argv square brackets 1, and we want that to simply be the slash and then the name of the function, in which case it's going to be fscan or file read underscored fgetc. But then what is going to be that third argument? So let's make sure that first we've got all of our matching curly braces. Well, the third argument is going to be the file name itself. So we can do a couple of things here. First, we can go ahead and create a temporary variable. I'm going to call it file name, and I'm going to make it fairly long. And so what we're going to do here is, assuming that our argv square brackets 2 is in fact a valid file, what we'd like to do now is we'd like to use our string copy function, and we're going to copy our argv square brackets 2 into our file name variable. Now, truth be told, this temporary variable file name does not actually need to be used. It's just a good opportunity for us to get some practice using string copy and get familiar with this. But after this, then what we want to do is we want to call our file read fgetc, and we want to pass to it the file name, the variable file name, and the second argument is the contents. Now the contents gets a little tricky because we don't know how big the file is. So we are going to have to make some assumptions because we're not going to be using any sort of dynamic memory for this example. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage a constant. And so we're going to start off, we're going to create a temporary variable contents. And then as far as for the size, what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our core.h, and we're going to specify then the largest number of characters that you would expect to see in a file. Now, we don't have to do this typically, but for this particular example, we're going to. So I'm actually going to specify then that the maximum number of characters that I'm going to get is going to be 1,000. So I'm going to use my, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to use my chunk length max. So the largest contents or chunk of characters that I would expect to give you for this particular example is going to be 1,000. Now, the reason why this is warning us or saying that it's unresolved is that because we have yet to include our core.h in our main file. So it's a good opportunity for us to go ahead and get this set up. Now, the second example then that we want to do is we want to go ahead and set up the logic that would allow for us to call our second function, in this case, our file_read fscanned f. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to sort of develop these two in parallel so that you can see both the similarities and the differences. So our third argument is once again going to be the file name, with the main difference here that we are going to use file_read fscanf, and we're going to pass to it now the file name, but also the contents. Now, we have a little bit of a problem because in both our file read fgetC as well as our file read fscanf, we don't know how many characters are actually going to be read in from the file. So some files may only have a few characters in them. Some of them may have more than 1,000. So this is where we want to take an opportunity to use our return value a little differently than we have in the past. And so if you notice here, we have return 0 or return exit success, which is only somewhat useful for us. Instead, what we would like to do is we would like to return the count. And so this way, what we can do, we can return the count even if the file doesn't exist. So if the file does exist, we start counting, and if it doesn't exist, then we simply return 0. So what we would want to do now is we would want to actually initialize the count outside of the if statement, even before we know whether or not the file exists. So our count serves a couple of purposes here, as it tells us whether or not the function was successful or not by virtue of the number of characters that it tried to return. Now, we can do the same thing down here. We're actually going to move the initialization outside of our if statement and then also return the count. That only solves half the problem for us, because the other problem is that we have a fixed size for our contents. Now, if you recall from the earlier video, I showed you how to have dual conditions or a combination of logic inside of our while loop to determine when you hit the end of string or you run out of characters. Essentially, what we're going to do is inside of our file read fgetC and our file read fscanf, we're going to check not only that that first condition is true, but we're also going to check for a second condition. And that second condition is going to be, and our count is less than, and this is where you want to leverage that constant. You're probably wondering, why did I not simply type in 1,000? Well, because now what I can do is I can leverage this chunk length max. And if I ever want to change the size of the file that I am capable of handling without changing the memory management model, in other words, allowing for dynamic memory allocation, instead what I can do now is I can just simply control it through the chunk length max. So if you notice, I've used it up here when I declared the variable, and I'm also using it here. Now note, you are probably creating an array bigger than you will typically need, so you will want to make sure and rethink this in the future for certain applications. But continuing along here, we also want to do this in our second function. So we're going to have an and count less than chunk length max. And then once again, make sure that you've got your parentheses matched. So basically what it's going to do is going to keep track of the actual count of the number of characters read from the file. Why do we care? Well, reading the contents of the file isn't all that interesting if we can't do anything with it once it gets returned. And so what I want to do is I want to leverage this index variable once again. I'm going to build a for loop, and I'm going to utilize the results from the file read fgetC. So I want to create one more temporary variable. It's going to be an int, and we're going to call it results. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to simply say results equal to file underscore read underscore fgetC, and results are equal to file underscore read underscore fscanf. Now, what I want to do is I want to use a for loop to read through all of the elements in contents, or all the characters in contents. So we're going to loop through all the characters in contents. All right, so to do this, we simply say for index equal to 0, index less than results, index plus plus, and we simply have a printf where we once again, we use %d to indicate the location in the vector, and %c to indicate the character. So index and then contents, square brackets, index. And there's really not any difference between what we do in either of these two branches here. Essentially, we're going to print out the contents the same way in both scenarios. Now, at this point, probably would be a good opportunity for us to see if we've actually accomplished anything. So we're going to go ahead and build this one more time. We're going to come out here to the command window. If we just type in the name of our executable, we should get the help, which reminds us that we probably should be updating our help. So why don't we go ahead and take just a second to go ahead and do that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to come down here to our help right now. There we go. And add a printf and slash file underscore read fgetC, which does remind me that we need an input file. And I have provided us one in the file, in the zip file that I gave you. And we are going to be using our sample underscore wiki.txt. We can follow this up with another line using our fscanf. And you can see here how we're essentially just documenting our project as we go along. Didn't mean to have the double slashes in there. All right, so once again, build it. If you run it again from the command window, you'll see that it's trying to tell us how we should do this. So if I type in, for instance, /file _ read fgetC, I should still get prompted because I haven't provided enough input arguments. And then if we do a dir, you'll see that I don't have my text file here. And so we could use relative paths, or what we could do is we could simply go into the distribution folder, into the debug folder, and wherever our core_demo is, we're going to just copy our files. I'm actually going to go ahead and copy a couple of examples here, our sample users.csv and our sample wiki.txt, so that we can use that in the future. But now we can use our sample _wiki.txt, and you'll see that we are printing out all of the characters and we're prefacing it by the index. Now notice, if you were very careful here, if you scroll up, you'll see that number one, we've got a few characters in here, some unhandled characters like new lines, carriage returns, but more importantly, you notice it did it twice. Okay, so if I scroll here, we have our scroll up, scroll up, scroll up. There's a lot of characters here. And if you'll notice that I'm restarting. So essentially I find 1,000 characters and then it kicks me out of my while loop in my fgetC. So if I didn't have that second condition there, the file that I've given you is actually too long. Okay, so it's very important to notice that. Now, you scroll down here one more time, and let's also check with our file, our fscanf version of this, and let's see how this one is working. And sure enough, it also seems to be working. The reason that it's printing twice is we print once inside of our file read fgetC, and then we also print once outside. So you could silence one of these two. As a matter of fact, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and silence this second one here. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out, and you'll see why in just a second. And I'm going to go ahead and silence this. So save it, build it. Now we won't get quite as much noise when we try to run this. All right, so all right, so now it only runs once. Now, quick thing to note, what would happen if we treated this as not as a character vector, but as a string? Well, if we came back out here and instead of using a for loop to print our content, so in other words, if we came along and did something like this, fprintf, and then %s with a new line, and then we pass the entire contents variable. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and put this here because we'd ultimately like to see this work. But watch what happens. So in other words, I'm going to go ahead and build this, and I'm going to see what happens. Did I accidentally damage something here? 1 second. Printf, sorry, not fprintf. There we go. If I run this one more time, it doesn't really matter if we do it on the fgetC or the fscanf. We're going to see this print out the results as a string. Okay, now if we run this also using our fscanf, okay, it's going to print out as if it was a string. But if you notice something, once again, something is wrong. And so if you're very careful and you notice the characters being printed out character by character, you'll notice that it appears as if it's trying to spell out the word special or something along those lines. At least it stops at the A. And then if you come here at the end of the string, there's the A, but then it runs into the name of the text file. Instead, what's happening here is, once again, we don't have an end of string character on contents. So one way that we can get around that is that essentially we stop one character short. So inside of our file read fgetC, we stop at chunk length -1. And then what we do is, in both of these cases, once we are done reading from the file, we simply say contents square brackets count, and we assign to it the end of string character. So in both cases, what we're going to do is we're essentially going to manually append the end of string character. Now, when we build this, we come back up here. It doesn't matter which one of our functions we run. It still ends, it does end one character earlier. Okay, you can see that it stops at the 999th value because it needed that 1000th place to be able to store the end of string character. But notice that you aren't overrunning the next piece of memory. Okay, so it's very important to note this. All right, so once again, hopefully you found this video useful. If you've got any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to email me. You've seen now 2 different ways to read the characters out of a file. We are going to be using fscanf. However, that does not mean that fgetC is not useful. You may find yourself using it in the future, as well as a couple of other functions with respect to file IO that we are not going to cover. But we are going to be using fscanf in our future work. Thank you for watching.